So Star Wars Outlaws is filled to the brim with little bits of Star Wars lore and Easter eggs. I've just finished my second playthrough and I've managed to find over 50 hidden secrets, and that's with so much left to explore throughout the game on pretty much every single planet. Today I've gathered 50 of the best Easter eggs that I've found throughout my playtime, and we're going to try and rapid fire through them as much as possible because obviously that is quite a lot to get through. Some of these are genuine Easter eggs, some of them are just little hidden things or nods to other pieces of Star Wars lore. Some of these are even just cool facts about the game or about Star Wars in general, and it's worth noting that although I won't really be talking about plot points from the main story, some of these do kind of toe the line of being spoiler territory, so if you're trying to avoid spoilers, I would recommend coming back and watching this after you finish the game. But with that being said, let's get stuck into 50 of the best Easter eggs, secrets, and cool facts about Star Wars Outlaws. Now, one of the first things that I stumbled across in this game is a little droid party that you can find in Miragana. If you head to this vent located here on the map, when you crawl through, you can find a bunch of maintenance droids having a little party in there, which I thought was a really cool little Easter egg from the developers. Early on in the game, you'll need to get past a Trandoshan bouncer in a nightclub on Canto Bight, and it's mentioned here in the game that he actually has a T-85 speeder, which is the exact same speeder model that Kanan has in Star Wars Rebels. Now, we can't find it in the game, unfortunately, but it is mentioned, which I thought was pretty cool. Throughout the main path, you will need to go to a downed cruiser on Toshara, and for those who didn't hear it in this moment, this is actually from the High Republic, and it is the exact same type of cruiser as the Disney Star Cruiser experience. It's known as a Purgle class Star Cruiser, and this is what they based the real life experience on, where you can essentially stay in a hotel that feels like it is a real Star Cruiser, so it's pretty cool to see that in game. In that exact same section, there is a mention of Starlight Beacon from the High Republic. This is a pretty pivotal location in the High Republic novels, and I'm sure any fans out there of the High Republic would absolutely love that mention. Now, lastly, for the High Republic, there is also a mention of the Nile, who are essentially the main protagonists of the High Republic. It turns out this cruiser came under attack from the Nile, and then they sped into hyperspace, which is what caused them to crash here on Toshara probably 200 years before the events of Star Wars Outlaws. Shortly after you arrive on Akiva, if you explore around the planet, you can find a note about ND5 and Nix, where the person writing this note on the datapad seems to be very, very interested in them. Now, it feels like this might be a nod to the community reaction. After this game was announced, a lot of people were referring to ND5 as the hot droid, simply because he's wearing a trench coat, and having talked to the developers in the lead up to this game, they were very much aware of that, so it feels like this might be a little bit of a nod to the community reaction towards ND5. Now, speaking of droids and Akiva, you can find an LAAT hidden away on the map. There is plenty of Clone Wars era stuff all over this planet, and you can find multiple crashed LAATs up in the hills. For those who weren't aware, this is what the clones used in the Clone Wars as transport ships, and they are seen plenty of times throughout Star Wars canon. Now, while we're on the topic of droids, there are plenty of IG droid heads all around the place. You can often see them throughout different cantinas in the world, and this is as they were in the original trilogy a lot of the time. Now, realistically, this was just a prop that they kind of reused throughout the original trilogy, so it's not really any deeper than that, but there are a lot of people out there who have their own headcanon that this is a part of why the bartender in the Mos Eisley Cantina says that we don't serve their kind when he's talking about droids. Some people have it in their headcanon that these guys just hated droids and they used the IG droid heads in the Mos Eisley Cantina. Now, speaking of IG droids, I'm sure you all know of IG-88, the bounty hunter, and another huge bounty hunter does appear in this game. Yes, that is right, Boba Fett is in Star Wars Outlaws. If you guys missed this, you can find him by looking through a vent on the mission where you're kind of rescuing Nix from Jabba's palace. He also has a bounty puck there that shows he is currently hunting down Asara, who is seen throughout the main story as well. This is a job that was most likely given to him by the Empire, just like many of his others throughout the Star Wars timeline. Now, also seen at Jabba's palace, you can find mention of the Boma monks and the fact that these are not to be harmed. Now, I didn't actually know this, but these are the spider creatures that we've seen throughout the original trilogy and even some of the more recent Disney stuff. And I didn't know this, but these were monks who transplanted their brains into nutrient-filled jars to isolate themselves from physical sensation and enhance the power of their brains. Not too sure that worked in the long run because they are literally just a walking spider, but each to their own. Now, while we're on Tatooine, there is a very famous location in Mos Eisley. This is Docking Bay 94, where you land the Trailblazer, and I'm sure most of you guys clocked this already, but for those who didn't, this is the same landing pad as where the Millennium Falcon is found throughout the events of A New Hope. Now, speaking of the Falcon, there is also mention of its cousin design towards the end of the game in a hidden datapad. It mentions the Corellian YT-2400. Now, the Millennium Falcon is the Corellian YT-1300, but they do share some similarities, and the 2400 has been seen countless times throughout canon and legends. It even mentions in the datapad that it is heavily involved in a smuggling ring, which could hint at this being Dash Rendar's ship, as he also had a YT-2400, though I could definitely be wrong with that. In that exact same datapad, there is also another little Easter egg, which is the planet up the top of the datapad called Plexus. This is a planet that has been mentioned before in Andor as well as Star Wars Uprising. Now back to Tatooine, ND5 mentions at a certain point throughout the game that Tatooine used to be an ocean-filled jungle planet. This is a nod to Legends, which was then also recanonized in some novels, comic books, and even the Book of Boba Fett. Apparently, due to the gravitational pull of the twin suns, it became far too hot and all the oceans essentially dried up. Speaking of dried up oceans, if you head out to the Dune Sea, there is a bit of a nod to the original trilogy here, because you can find some Krayt Dragon bones, which are iconically in the background when we first see C-3PO and R2-D2 landing on Tatooine. Now, they kind of look nothing like what an actual Krayt Dragon looks like, so I think they've done that on purpose just to be a bit of a nod to the original trilogy, because although most people don't know this, Krayt Dragons actually do have legs. Now, speaking of Krayt Dragons, for those who didn't see this throughout the game, which I'm sure most of you probably did, but you can find a live Krayt Dragon out in the Dune Sea as well. If you ride your speeder out there, you will almost undoubtedly come across the Krayt Dragon. It's pretty scary, but it is awesome to see, and if you let it get too close, it will definitely mess you up. There are plenty more Easter eggs as well on Tatooine. Most of these ones here are from Tatooine, and the most notable one for me is that you can find the Lars homestead down in the bottom right of Tatooine. I'm sure you guys already know this, but this is where Owen and Beru lived, and it's where Luke grew up. You can even see the charred ground where Owen and Beru were unfortunately burned to death in A New Hope. Now, while you're there, if you drop down into it, you can also find a chest here, and when you open that, you can get a scarf for Nix. Now, I'm not too sure if this is meant to be a nod to Lars, who was Owen's father that we saw in the prequels. I'm not too sure what else this scarf would be alluding to, so I'm going to have to assume this is a bit of a nod to Lars, because we did see him wearing one throughout Attack of the Clones. While you're down there as well, you can also find a note from Owen, or probably more likely Beru, mentioning the T-16 Skyhopper toy. Now, this is Luke's toy that we saw Obi-Wan give him in the Kenobi show, and he also had it in the original trilogy. This note even mentions the blue milk cheese, which is pretty cool too. Now, the final Easter egg to do with the Lars homestead, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but I have a feeling that this note that I just talked about was sent to Tika, who sold Obi-Wan the toy in the first place. Now, if that name rings a bell, yes, Tika, the expert in this game, the Jawa expert, she was actually the Jawa from the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, which I thought was an awesome little nod. So Tika herself is actually a little Easter egg that I think most people will miss. If you head to the Mos Eisley Cantina, you can see scorch marks where Greedo missed Han when they had their little altercation in that booth. That was one of the first things that I looked for when I went into the cantina, just to see if I could find the booth, and as you can see, that scorch mark is still there even years later. Now, finally, not too far away from the Lars homestead, you can actually head over to Tosche Station, which is a pretty cool little nod as well. That's pretty much the first sentence that Luke Skywalker ever said in Star Wars, and it's pretty ironic that we get to head over to Tosche Station when Luke couldn't actually ever do that in the original trilogy, despite that being the first thing that he wanted to do. When you get a max reputation with the Hutts in this game, the reward they give you seems to be a nod to Sabine from Rebels. The little chest armor that is underneath the jacket that Kay wears, it does look very similar to Mandalorian armor, and it also has that typical Phoenix Squadron color palette to it, so I have to assume this is a nod to Sabine. Now, speaking of Rebels, back on Canto Bight, there is mention of the Malu Run. This is a fruit that is super common throughout Rebels, and it is actually introduced in the very first episode when Ezra is trying to steal weapons from the Empire. Now, speaking of Ezra Bridger, and this is a massive one for any of you Rebels fans, he can actually be found in this game. If you head to this massive palace on Tatooine, you can actually see Ezra Bridger sitting here. He's pretty hard to miss, so I don't know how I haven't really seen people talking about this one, but I thought you Rebels fans would enjoy that. Now, just out of curiosity, if you got that joke, please do leave a comment down below. I want to know how many of you guys are Rebels fans that actually understood that reference. Now, that is 25 Easter eggs and hidden secrets so far in this video. Before we get on to the next 25, if you guys have enjoyed the video so far, I would love it if you could drop a like on the video. I've put so much time and effort into this one, so much research, and like I said, 2 full playthroughs of the game. So if you have enjoyed it, please do consider leaving a like, and if you are new here, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any upcoming Star Wars Outlaws content. Now, getting into the second lot of 25 Easter eggs. I did just mention Ezra Bridger, otherwise known as Jabba the Hutt, and if you guys didn't know, D. Bradley Baker actually voices Jabba the Hutt, as well as Nix in this game. If you don't know who D. Bradley Baker is, he is the voice behind pretty much all of the clones throughout all of Star Wars, other than obviously the ones in live action, which were Tamara Morrison. There is mention of a squadron called Typhoon Squadron, who are from the Rebellion, and this is a little nod to Star Wars Squadrons where they first showed up. It's always awesome when we get a little crossover from one Star Wars game to another. Now, another nod to some other Star Wars games is the fact that when you're looking around Slero's collections, and I think you can even find this in some Crimson Dawn areas as well, you can find a TL-50 blaster. Now, the TL-50 is a nod to the Battlefront games because that is where it first appeared, most notably as Iden Versio's weapon of choice, and this has also been seen in The Mandalorian. I'm sure a lot of hardcore fans knew this one, but a lot of people are going to miss this. Temmin Wexley, the expert that we meet on Akiva, this is actually Snap Wexley from the sequel trilogy. He does also appear in the Aftermath Trilogy 2, which is where Akiva first showed up, and that's also how a lot of us knew that there would be a droid factory in the catacombs of Akiva 2. In certain areas of Akiva, if you listen to some of the Stormtrooper chatter, you can hear them mention the Purge, which for those who don't know is where the Empire bombed Mandalore, and that is confirmed to have only taken place about 3 years before Star Wars Outlaws.
Met a pilot once who was at the Purge. Said there's nothing left but ash.
Speaking of Akiva 2, we can also find a data pad on Akiva which has Ochi of Bestoon's report of a job. I'm sure that name rings a bell to a lot of you guys. He is first seen in the sequel trilogy, and he is essentially the one who killed Rey's parents. On top of that showing up, we can also see the same model ship as Ochi of Bestoon's, which is somewhat famous from the sequels. That's the one that took Rey's parents off Jakku. So we see it, I believe, in all 3 of the sequel movies, though this one is just Vale's ship, so it's not actually his, at least not likely, but I thought that was pretty cool that it is the same model. Now, speaking of Vale, Slero mentions that he knows of a bunch of her belongings which are on Niamos. You guys may have heard of this before. It was seen in Andor, and this is what a lot of people were referring to as Space Florida, because it does look like some sort of a beach resort type of planet. This game does also mention another planet called Vasek, which is on a data pad, and this planet was first seen in the Lair of Grievous episode in the Clone Wars, which was the 10th ever episode of that show. There is some more Stormtrooper chatter, where you can overhear some of the Stormtroopers talking about Tarkin's will. This was Tarkin's Star Destroyer that was originally called the Fortitude, but when he died on the Death Star, another officer took control and called it Tarkin's Will in honor of Tarkin.
I was on the Tarkin's will before coming here. Got relocated the day before it crashed.
You can find a data pad throughout the game that mentions Project Swarm, which was the Imperial project to find the Rebel hideout. We saw that at the very beginning of Empire Strikes Back with the Viper droids being sent out to different planets, and we've now found out that this was still ongoing during the events of Star Wars Outlaws. There is also a brief mention of Scarif throughout the game by the character called Toshara, which I'm sure anyone who's a big fan of Rogue One, your ears definitely would have perked up when you heard Scarif. In the final key mission with Kira throughout this main story, one of her bodyguards actually mentions to her that the Vermilion is ready. Now, if you guys didn't know, the Vermilion is a Crimson Dawn flagship from the comic series, so it's awesome to see that mentioned in a different form of Star Wars media. Now, ironically, when you're on Kijimi as well, after one of those missions with Kira, you can also hear ND5 mention an auction that went pretty bad with Kira. Now, this is actually the Han Solo auction from some of the Crimson Dawn comics, which funnily enough took place on the Vermilion that I just mentioned. And this is where Crimson Dawn essentially auctioned off Han Solo in Carbonite, which Jabba the Hutt paid 1 million credits for, where we see him later on in Jabba's palace. Now, speaking of Crimson Dawn and Han Solo, in the Solo movie at the very beginning, we can see Han and Kira using an M68 land speeder to try and escape from Corellia. Now, this can actually be seen throughout the game. As far as I know, it's only on Toshara, but you might be able to find this on other planets, and I thought that was cool to see a very, very cool looking speeder once again. Now, back on Akiva, there is a single red tree, which is the massive red tree that Kay sort of mentions the first time you go past it. Now, this is actually called the Blood Tree, and it seems to be a nod to a Legends novel called Rogue Planet, which is where the Blood Tree was first mentioned. There is actually a hidden expert in this game called MT7, and when you are doing the mission to unlock MT7, towards the end of it, he does name drop General Grievous, because this poor droid thought he was still on a mission from way back in the Clone Wars. Now, when you finally unlock MT7, he does have a few abilities, some of which are called Improvise, Adapt, and Overcome, which I'm sure you guys have heard before. Now, not only is this a Marine Corps saying, I believe, but it was also used in Clint Eastwood's Heartbreak Ridge, a very famous movie, and I'm not too sure if this does line up, but it's commonly known that George Lucas took a lot of inspiration from old Western films when it comes to the original trilogy of Star Wars, though Heartbreak Ridge did come out after the original trilogy. There is even more stormtrooper chatter, which you can listen to on Tatooine. One of the stormtroopers actually says that they love sand, which is obviously a bit of a meme about Anakin's line in Attack of the Clones. When you first meet Gadeek throughout the main story, we see that he's building a black killer version of a protocol droid. Now, this isn't actually Dr. Aphra's droid, but it could be a nod to 000 from the Vader comics, who was Dr. Aphra's droid that was very similar to this droid that we see when we first meet Gadeek. Speaking of protocol droids, if you break into a certain Crimson Dawn hideout throughout the game, you can find a little nod here to C-3PO and R2-D2. It's obviously not them, but as far as I know, this is one of the only times we see a protocol droid and an R2 unit standing right next to each other throughout the game. Something that I have mentioned in a previous video is that if you aim at Nix, he will actually play dead with you. He'll stand up and then eventually K says bang, and he'll roll over and play dead, which I thought was pretty awesome. In the exclusive pre-order mission that was only available for the Gold and Deluxe edition of the game, there is a single mission called Jabba's Gambit. Now, in that mission, ND5 mentions Gracchus the Hutt, who's another Hutt that lived on Nar Shaddaa, and he was part of the Hutt Council until Jabba seized control, which is sort of part of that whole storyline. We know that there is plenty of different Clone Wars nods on Akiva, but one that I thought was absolutely awesome is that when you're traveling around, you can find repurposed STAP speeders that battle droids used to use throughout the Clone Wars, and a lot of people on Akiva have pretty much just put seats on them and turned them into their own speeders. Now, last but definitely not least, we have a really cool mention here of the Black Sun. It turns out that Vale had done a little bit of work with them, and this is a crime syndicate that a lot of people really wanted in this game, as they are probably one of the more popular crime syndicates in Star Wars. I'm not going to get my hopes up, but hopefully this means there could potentially be even more mentions of the Black Sun in some of the upcoming DLC. But anyway, guys, that is it for 50 Easter eggs, hidden secrets, and cool facts about Star Wars Outlaws. If you guys did enjoy the video, I would love it if you guys could drop a like down below. And like I said, if you are new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. There is plenty more content on the way, so make sure you don't miss out. If you guys have found any Easter eggs yourself that you think I missed in this video, be sure to leave them down below. I'm absolutely certain there's so much stuff in this game that I've missed, so be sure to let us all know in the comment section. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and may the Force be with you always.